So here's the thing about living with someone you barely know: you start to notice stuff you were never supposed to notice. Not because you're nosy, not because you're looking, but because when two people share 200 square feet of life, some things just leak out. Through the walls, through the quiet, through the version of themselves they forget to hide when they think nobody's watching. His name was Caleb. And no, this isn't a love story that starts with fireworks or a movie moment or some perfectly timed eye contact across a crowded room. It starts with a water bill and a Craigslist ad and me being 23 years old with exactly $940 in my checking account, trying to find a room in a city that had already decided it didn't care about me. I'd moved to Portland from a small town in Indiana called Waverly. You've never heard of it. Nobody has. It's the kind of place where the most exciting thing that happens is when the Methodist Church gets a new sign out front, and even that becomes a 6-week conversation at the diner. I left not because I hated it. I actually loved some of it. The way the cornfields looked in late August, the way everybody showed up when somebody's barn flooded. But I left because I was running out of room inside myself, and I didn't know how to explain that to anyone who'd lived their whole life there. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that smelled like old radiator heat and someone's perpetual curry. The hallway carpet was this faded burgundy color that might have been cheerful in 1987. My room had one window that faced a brick wall, but there was a gap between the buildings just wide enough to see a sliver of sky, and honestly, on the day I moved in, that felt like enough. Caleb was already there when I arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, wearing a paint-stained gray hoodie with the drawstrings pulled uneven, one side hanging way lower than the other, and he had this kind of unwashed, exhausted look about him that wasn't unattractive, just honest, like someone who hadn't been sleeping right. He looked up when I came through the door dragging my duffel bag, and instead of saying hi he said, "You want coffee? I made too much." That was it, that was our introduction. "Sure," I said. He got up, poured me a cup without asking how I took it, slid it across the table and sat back down. We sat in that kitchen for maybe 20 minutes not really talking about anything. He asked where I was from. I said Indiana. He said he'd driven through Indiana once and it had seemed nice. I said it was, kind of. He nodded like that was a complete conversation. I found out through the lease paperwork he was 26. He worked from home doing something with graphic design, logos, brand stuff, that kind of thing. He paid his share of rent on the first of every month, and he was quiet, like genuinely quiet, not awkward quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt purposeful, like he was saving his words for things that actually mattered. For the first few weeks we were basically strangers with a shared refrigerator. We had our labeled shelves. We figured out the bathroom schedule without ever actually discussing it. He cooked dinner around 7 most nights and always made enough for 2 but never said anything about it. The extra portion would just be sitting on the stove with a plate upside down on top of it keeping it warm. I figured that out by week 2. That the upside-down plate was an invitation, not an accident. I started eating his cooking without either of us acknowledging we'd made that arrangement. It should have felt weird, and maybe it did at first, but then it just became normal. The quiet between us became comfortable, not empty. There's a difference. The night everything shifted, not dramatically, not in some big cinematic way, but shifted in the way that changes the texture of everything from that point forward. That night started ordinary. It was a Tuesday in November. Rain against the windows, the kind of steady rain that makes the whole world feel like it's inside a gray wool blanket. I'd been job hunting all day, which meant I'd been sitting at my desk feeling progressively worse about my life, and Caleb had been on a deadline. I could tell because he got very quiet in a different way when he was stressed. The apartment felt more still, if that makes sense, like he was pulling all the air in toward himself. Around 11 I went to get water and he was on the couch. A laptop opened on the coffee table, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers next to it, and he was asleep, just fully out. Sitting slightly sideways with his head dropped back against the cushion, mouth barely open, the kind of sleep that falls on you like a dropped curtain. The lamp on the side table was on, and in that warm yellow light, with the rain outside and the quiet of the apartment, he looked, I don't know. He looked like a person who'd finally let their guard down, like the version of himself he was when he wasn't performing. I almost just went back to my room. I actually turned around. And then I stopped because the laptop screen caught my eye, not snooping. I want to be really clear about that because it matters to me that you understand I wasn't looking for anything. The screen was bright and the apartment was dim. I was 3 feet away and my brain registered the image before I made a decision about whether to look. It was an illustration. Detailed, careful, clearly worked on for hours. 2 men, drawn in this gorgeous blue and ink style, sitting together at a table with their foreheads almost touching, hands overlapping in the middle. And around them this elaborate world of plants and book spines and soft lamplight, like someone had taken the most private feeling they'd ever had and tried to build a room around it. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. And then I understood. It was personal work, not a client project, something he was making for himself or maybe for no reason except that it needed to exist. I stood there longer than I should have, not because of anything weird, but because the drawing was genuinely beautiful. There was so much tenderness in it. The way the hands were drawn, like the artist had spent a lot of time thinking about what it feels like to have someone's hand near yours. Like that closeness was the whole point. I went to bed without the water. I lay there for a while not sleeping, and I wasn't analyzing the drawing, I wasn't building a whole story around it, I was just sitting with the feeling of having seen something true about someone. Something they hadn't shown me, something they maybe didn't show anyone. Here's what I knew about myself at that point. I'd known I was gay since I was 16, came out to two people in Waverly, my cousin Dissa and my friend Marcus, and that was the extent of my outness. Not because I was ashamed, but because in Waverly coming out felt like an announcement that you were about to leave, and I hadn't been ready to leave yet. Even in Portland I hadn't really, I don't know. I was existing on the edges of my own life, still not fully moved in, if that makes sense, like I'd unpacked my clothes but not myself. So discovering that my roommate might be gay was less of a shock and more of a strange warmth, like recognizing something without being able to name it yet. I didn't say anything the next morning. He was up before me like always, and when I came out he was at the table doing that thing where he had coffee in one hand and was scrolling through his phone in this detached morning brain way. He looked up and said, "There's eggs if you want." "Thanks," I said. And that was it. But I started paying attention differently. Not in an obsessive way, just I noticed things I'd been letting slide by. Like how he had exactly one framed photo in his room, visible through the door if it was open at the right angle, and it was of him and another guy, laughing at something outside a food truck, looking unself-consciously happy in a way that the Caleb I knew in the apartment didn't quite look. I noticed how he never talked about anyone he was dating or had dated. I noticed the very careful distance he maintained, the physical space he kept, like he'd trained himself not to take up more room than was offered. And I noticed that he was kind. Like genuinely, quietly kind in ways he seemed to hope nobody would catch. He fixed the squeaky hinge on my bedroom door one afternoon while I was out. He bought more of my shampoo when he went to the store and put it in the bathroom without mentioning it. When I was sick the first week of December, he made this garlic and ginger soup thing and left a bowl on my desk with a note that just said "drink all of it" in his handwriting, no signature, like he was embarrassed by the gesture. I kept trying to figure out how to be a person around him. Because here's the thing I hadn't expected, I liked him. Not even romantically at first, or not only, I just liked him as a person in a way that felt unfamiliar and slightly terrifying, because in my experience liking people that much had a pretty consistent track record of eventually hurting. December moved. The apartment got colder because the building's heat was unreliable, and we discovered that if you wanted it warm you had to kind of coax the radiator by turning it on and off in a very specific sequence that Caleb had figured out and I had not. So I started spending more of my evenings in the living room where the heat was better and where Caleb usually was. We watched things together, not really choosing to, just ending up in the same room watching whatever. He had opinions about documentary filmmaking that he'd share in these burst-and-retreat ways, like he'd say something and then look slightly surprised at himself for having said it. I found this completely endearing. He was interested in the history of cartography, which I didn't even know was something people were specifically interested in, until I asked him about a book on his shelf one evening. "Maps," I said, "like old maps." "Not just old ones, maps in general," he paused. "The way people have understood space over time, what they chose to include, what they left out, what they were afraid of or didn't know about and just drew a monster instead." I thought about that for a while. "That's kind of what everyone does," I said. "With their own, like, internal stuff, draw monsters in the spaces they don't understand yet." He looked at me for a second in that particular way he had, where his eyes went slightly still like he was deciding whether to say something. "Yeah," he said, "exactly like that." There was a whole conversation in that 2-second exchange that neither of us was ready to have out loud. Then Christmas came, and both of us stayed in the city. He mentioned his family was in Seattle and it was complicated, and I said mine was in Indiana and it was fine but far, and we kind of nodded at each other and ordered Thai food and watched old episodes of a nature documentary series. And somewhere around 9 o'clock he fell asleep on the couch again. This seemed to be a pattern for him, the early evening exhaustion, and this time I was sitting right there so I could not see it. And this time, instead of looking at his laptop, I just looked at him. Not in a weird way, not longingly or whatever. I was just aware of the fact that here was this person I shared a life with in this very partial, circumscribed way. And I barely knew him, and what I did know I liked a lot, and he was asleep 3 feet away from me looking like someone carrying more than he ever talked about. He woke up about 20 minutes later and did that thing people do where they take a second to remember where they are, and then he saw me, and for just a flash, a half second before he organized his face, he looked surprised. Not alarmed, just surprised, like he'd expected to wake up alone and hadn't. "Sorry," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Was I out long?" 20 minutes maybe." He rubbed his face. "I keep doing that." "I know," I paused. "You're not sleeping well." He looked at me differently then, not defensively, more like he was reassessing something. "No," he said, "not really." "You want to talk about it or just sit here?" He thought about that for a second. "Just sit here," he said. "Okay." And we did for another hour. The nature documentary rolled through its episodes. The radiator clicked and hissed. Outside, Portland did its winter thing with the cold rain. And we sat there and it was fine and it was warm, and I remember thinking that this was one of the better evenings I'd had in a long time, and I didn't know what to do with that. On New Year's Eve we went to a small party at a friend's apartment, a friend of his, a woman named Priya who did something in urban planning and had a gift for making every social occasion feel effortlessly warm. There were maybe 12 people there, fairy lights strung everywhere, someone had made mulled wine, the music was good without being loud. I didn't know anyone except Caleb, and Caleb wasn't exactly the guy who pulls you into conversations, so I found myself doing a lot of standing near walls and watching the room. Which I'm not complaining about, I'm an observer by nature. I like watching the way people interact when they feel comfortable. And watching Caleb interact with people he trusted was something. He smiled more, I talked more. I had this dry, understated sense of humor that I'd only gotten hints of in the apartment, and here it was in full, a quiet observation that made the person nearest to him almost choke on their drink, and then this very contained, pleased expression on his face like he'd been aiming for exactly that. He was good with people in a private way. Not performing, just good. Priya caught me watching him at some point and came to stand next to me. "You're his roommate," she said, not a question. "Yeah, 6 months now." She looked at me, then at him, then back. "He seems better," she said. "Lighter, since you moved in, I mean." She said it casually like it was just an observation and then drifted back into the room. I stood there with my mulled wine and turned that over in my head. At midnight, everyone did the counting down thing, and there was noise and toasting and hugging, and I was standing next to Caleb and we looked at each other and he said, "Happy New Year," in this kind of quiet way, like he was actually saying it to me specifically and not to the room. "You too," I said. He touched his cup to mine. That was it, and somehow it was a lot. January was when things started to get complicated, and by complicated I mean they started to become real in ways I couldn't pretend I wasn't noticing. He'd started showing me some of his personal work. The illustrations, not the laptop in the middle of the night but deliberately on Saturday mornings sometimes, he'd mention something he was working on and turn his sketchbook toward me, like he was testing something, like he was slowly deciding I was safe. The illustrations were extraordinary. I don't mean that as a compliment I'm paying him, I mean they were genuinely, functionally extraordinary in a way that made me feel like I'd been missing something my whole life that these images were describing. He had this ability to make emotional states into spaces. Loneliness looked like a specific kind of room with him. Hope looked like light coming through a very particular crack. Love, or whatever the thing before love is, looked like two people in a world he'd built entirely around the quality of their proximity. I asked him once who the people in his drawings were. "Nobody specific," he said, then quieter, "Everybody I've been." I didn't push, but I thought about that answer for days. The thing about a slow-developing feeling is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where a light goes on and you think, "Ah yes, this is happening." It's more like you start to realize you've been arranging your whole day around certain moments without meaning to, and then you notice that you've been doing it, and then you have to decide what to do with that information. I was arranging my day around Caleb. Around dinner at 7, around the sound of him moving around the apartment in the morning, around the 3 or 4 things per day he'd say that were somehow exactly interesting enough to think about afterward. I hadn't said a word about any of this to anyone. Partly because there was nothing to say yet, no event, no declaration, no clarity, and partly because I still didn't know enough about what he felt or who he was to know if I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. The confirmation came accidentally, as these things tend to. Mid-January, he'd left his sketchbook on the kitchen table, which he almost never did. His personal work was usually kept private. The sketchbook went with him. It was a rule he maintained without stating it. But he'd rushed out to pick up something from a client and he'd left it there, and I was making coffee and it was open. I almost didn't look. I genuinely almost just went back to my room. But it was open to a page that had a sketch on it that was clearly not finished, rough, early stage, just pencil lines, and it was a person sitting at a kitchen table in what was very obviously our kitchen. The table, the window, the shelf above the stove, and the person at the table was drawn from behind, slightly hunched over a coffee mug, and there was enough specificity in the shoulders and the outline that I knew who it was supposed to be. It was me. He'd been drawing me. I closed the sketchbook, I poured my coffee, I went and sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a while. Here's the problem with realizing someone might have feelings for you when you have feelings for them. It doesn't get simpler. You'd think that's where things get easy, two people both interested, problem solved. But actually what happens is the stakes feel suddenly catastrophic. Because now there's something to lose. Before this, I'd had a complicated feeling and no information. Now I had information and I had no idea what to do with it, because any move in the wrong direction meant I might lose the person and the home and the dinner at 7 and the upside-down plate and all of it. I spent a week being slightly strange around him, and he noticed because of course he noticed. He was observant in the same quiet way I was. "You okay?" he asked one evening. "Yeah," I said, "yeah, just adjusting to something." He looked at me for a moment, nodded, didn't push. But for the rest of that evening he was slightly more careful around me, more considerate of the space between us, and I realized the carefulness was a form of tending. The actual conversation happened on a Sunday. I'd been up since early, couldn't sleep, and I was at the kitchen table with a book I wasn't reading when he came out around 9 in the same state, couldn't sleep, up early, a little worn at the edges. He got coffee and sat across from me, and we both pretended to be doing things for about 10 minutes. And then neither of us was pretending anymore. We were just sitting in the early morning light with our coffees and the particular quiet of a Sunday in January. "I saw the drawing," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do, just directly, because the body gets tired of waiting for the mind to find the right phrasing. He didn't say anything for a second. The expression on his face went through several things quickly. "The sketchbook," I said, "last week it was open. I wasn't snooping, I just saw it and I stopped. I'm sorry, that's not even the point, I'm saying this badly." "What's the point?" he asked very quietly. "The point is that I looked at my coffee cup. I'm not good at this, I haven't been my whole life. I've been pretty bad at the part where you actually say the thing. I've sort of lived in the gap between feeling something and saying it, and I've got comfortable there, and I stopped again. I'm gay," I said. Which I realize is a strange sentence to lead with, but I'm saying it because I want you to have that information. The apartment was very quiet. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. "I'm gay," he said. "I know," I said, and then immediately, "I'm sorry, I don't actually know, the drawings and just everything about you, and I didn't want to assume, No," he said, "you're right, he looked out the window toward that sliver of sky. "I've been drawing you," he said. "I've been drawing you for like 2 months, and I keep telling myself it's just practice, and that is possibly the most obvious lie I've ever told myself." I didn't say anything. "I'm not," he started. "This isn't something I do, I keep my life very separated, like compartments, and you're my roommate, and I didn't want to make it weird, and I really, really didn't want to lose." He stopped. "Lose what?" I asked. "This," he said, a gesture that somehow encompassed everything. The kitchen, the table, the coffees, the 7 o'clock dinners, all of it. "Caleb," I said, and then I didn't know what to put after his name, so I just let it sit there. He looked at me. "I don't want to lose this either," I said. "That's the whole thing, that's what I'm scared of that too, but I'm also sitting here at 9 in the morning on a Sunday feeling like something is going to break open whether we name it or not, so I'd rather just name it." He was quiet for a long time. "And then, I made food last night," he said. "I wasn't just making enough for 2, I was making what I thought you'd want, the specific things." His voice was very low. "I've been doing that for months and not saying anything about it." I felt something unlock in my chest. The upside-down plate, I said. Yeah, I noticed. He looked at me and did that small, contained thing where one corner of his mouth moved. We didn't fix everything in that one Sunday morning conversation. We didn't kiss or make any declarations or figure out what we were doing. What happened was we talked, actually talked, for the first time without the careful management of distance we'd both been maintaining. For 3 hours maybe, through multiple coffees, through the morning light crossing the kitchen floor, through all the surface stuff and then the deeper stuff, the Indiana stuff and the complicated Seattle family stuff, the being gay and not quite out to most people stuff, the what am I doing with my life stuff, the I've been lonely for a long time stuff. He told me about the guy in the photo I'd seen. His name was Devin, they'd been together for 2 years in his early 20s. It had ended not badly, but the way things end when you're not quite the people yet that you're going to become, with kindness and grief in about equal measure. He'd moved to Portland partly to reset, to figure out how to be himself more openly, more consistently, without constantly managing what he let out and what he kept locked down. Is it working? I asked. Lately more than before, he said. I told him about Waverly, about living small, about how I'd gotten so used to not taking up space that I'd forgotten I was allowed to. You take up space, he said. You don't notice how much. The apartment, I don't know how to explain this, but it feels different since you got here. Better different. Priya had said something similar. I didn't mention that. We didn't decide anything concrete that day, and I think that was right. We weren't the kind of people who could have handled a neat resolution. We needed to let it be uncertain for a little longer while we got used to the idea of it. We went back to our regular Sunday. He made lunch, I did my laundry, we watched something in the afternoon, and it was the same and entirely different. That night I was in my room and I heard him knock on the doorframe. I looked up. He was holding his sketchbook. Can I show you something? He asked. He sat on the edge of my desk chair and opened it, not to the one I'd seen, the rough early sketch, but further along. He'd finished it, or most of it. The same kitchen, the same figure from behind at the table, but now the image was full, filled in with his blue ink style, and the light on the whole scene was something you'd want to live inside. And then I saw that the perspective had changed from the first version. In the finished version, there were 2 mugs on the table. He'd put himself in it. I looked at the drawing for a long time. This is beautiful, I said. I know what I want, he said. I'm not always good at going after it, but I know what it is. The first time he kissed me was 3 days later at the end of an ordinary weeknight evening, standing in the kitchen while I was rinsing dishes. He just came and stood next to me and turned and kissed me once, soft and very deliberate, and then pulled back and looked at me like he was making sure. Yeah, I said, even though he hadn't asked anything out loud. He smiled then, not the small contained one but a real one, the kind you can't plan or manufacture, and went back to what he'd been doing, and we finished cleaning up the kitchen like normal, and everything was the same and nothing was. We took it slow, not artificially slow, not because of rules, but because we were both people who'd learned to be careful with the things we valued, and we valued each other, and we weren't going to rush something that felt like it deserved time. We went out together the last Saturday of January, just us, which was not technically different from things we'd done before except that it was, because now when I sat across from him at a small table in a coffee shop I wasn't managing how much I looked at him, and he wasn't managing the space between our hands on the table. He told me in that coffee shop that the project I'd seen on his laptop that first night, the men at the table with the lamplight whirled around them, he'd started that drawing right after I moved in. He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't need to. By February, we had stopped being careful about the not looking, not touching, not acknowledging thing. Not loudly, we still weren't dramatic people, neither of us had that impulse, but quietly, incrementally, we stopped maintaining the distance. One evening, I found a new sketchbook on my desk, plain black cover, brand new. No note, but the gesture was so specifically him that it was the same as a very long letter. I started writing in it instead of drawing. I can't draw, just notes and observations, the kind of inner monologue I'd never really written down before. And sometimes I'd leave it on the kitchen table and he'd read it, and sometimes he'd draw something small in the margins. A plant, a window, a light. We built something in those months, in that apartment with the faded burgundy carpet and the difficult radiator and the one window looking out at a sliver of sky. We built it quietly, out of dinners and mornings and honesty applied slowly, in layers, the way paint goes onto a surface, each layer needing to dry before the next one can hold. What I want to tell you, and I know this sounds like the kind of thing you say at the end of a story to make it feel complete, is that it wasn't complete. It isn't. We still have the weird conversations and the off days and the times when one of us shuts down and the other one doesn't know how to reach through it. We still have the stuff that doesn't get solved. But here's the thing I came back to, the thing I kept finding in the middle of the good days and the hard ones. I saw him asleep on the couch one night before I knew any of this was coming, before I knew any of who he was. And something about watching a person be unguarded, be temporarily relieved of the effort of performing existence, something about that was when it started for me, even if I didn't have words for it yet. He let me see him. Not the drawing, I mean that too, but more than that. Over all those months, he let me see him in the particular private way that is the most vulnerable thing a person can do, and I don't take that lightly. I stayed in Portland. The job I eventually found is fine, good actually. The apartment is still third floor, still the brick view, but the sliver of sky is enough, more than enough most days. On the refrigerator, there's a small drawing he made and taped up without saying anything. Our kitchen table from above, 2 coffee cups, 2 plates, early morning light coming in from the left, and in the corner in his handwriting so small you have to be right up close to read it. Here is where we figured it out. I still think about what he said about maps, about what people left out, what they didn't understand and so turned into monsters, about all the territory in yourself you labeled dangerous because you haven't explored it yet. He mapped something I'd left blank for years. I didn't know a roommate could do that, I didn't know a person could do that. But he was always underneath the quiet and the careful distance and the too much food on the stove and the drawings he made in private. He was always the kind of person who made the world feel more navigable just by existing in it near you. And I was lucky enough to need a room in a city I barely knew at the exact moment he had one to offer. Some things are just that simple. Some things are just exactly that.